Don Rickles built his entire career on one simple rule: never let them see you vulnerable. For 40 years, he'd hidden behind insults and jokes. He'd roasted presidents, movie stars, and mob bosses. He'd made Johnny Carson laugh until he cried. He'd turned pain into punchlines and fear into comedy gold. But on February 17, 1988, sitting on the Tonight Show couch, Don Rickles broke his own rule. He started talking about his father, about a childhood memory he'd buried for decades, about the moment that shaped everything he became. And as the words poured out, his voice began to shake. Johnny reached across the desk. The cameras kept rolling. And for the first time in Tonight Show history, Don Rickles wasn't trying to make anyone laugh. He was just trying not to cry. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand who Don Rickles really was. Not the character, not the insult comic, but the man underneath all those layers of armor. Donald J. Rickles was born in Queens, New York in 1926. His father, Max Rickles, was an immigrant from Lithuania who worked as an insurance salesman. His mother, Etta, was the dreamer of the family. She believed her son could be somebody. She believed he had a gift. But Max didn't see it that way. Max Rickles was a quiet man, a serious man, a man who'd crossed an ocean to build a life in America, and he didn't have time for show business dreams. He wanted his son to have a real job, stability, security, something you could count on. When young Don would practice comedy routines in his bedroom, Max would walk past the door and shake his head. When Don talked about wanting to be an entertainer, Max would change the subject. And when Don finally told his father he was going to pursue comedy full-time, Max looked at him with disappointment in his eyes and said, "You're wasting your life." Those 4 words became a weight Don Rickles carried for the next 40 years. After high school, Don served in the Navy during World War II. He came home in 1946, and like so many young veterans, he didn't know what to do with himself. His mother encouraged him to study acting. His father thought it was foolish. Don enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York. He studied Shakespeare. He auditioned for serious roles. He wanted to be the next Marlon Brando. But casting directors took one look at his face and laughed. He wasn't leading man material. He wasn't handsome enough. He wasn't tall enough. He wasn't anything enough. So Don did what survivors do. He adapted. He started doing comedy in small clubs around New York and later in Los Angeles. But his act wasn't working. He'd try to tell jokes the traditional way, and audiences would just stare at him. He was dying up there, night after night. Then one evening in 1956, at a tiny club in Miami Beach, something snapped. A heckler in the front row wouldn't shut up, and instead of ignoring him, Don turned and unleashed war. He insulted the man's haircut, his suit, his wife, his entire existence. The room went silent for a moment, and then they exploded with laughter. Don Rickles had found his voice, but he'd also built a wall. Because if you insult everyone first, they can never hurt you. If you make fun of yourself before anyone else can, you stay in control. If you turn your pain into a punchline, nobody ever sees you bleed. By the early 1960s, Don Rickles was becoming famous. He was the guy who roasted Frank Sinatra, the guy who called everyone hockey puck, the guy who could insult you to your face and somehow make you love him for it. And Johnny Carson adored him. Johnny had Don on The Tonight Show for the first time in 1965, and the chemistry was instant. Don would walk out, insult Johnny's suit, insult the band, insult the audience, and Johnny would laugh harder than anyone, because Johnny understood what Don was really doing. He saw past the act. Over the years, Don appeared on The Tonight Show more than 100 times. He became one of Johnny's most frequent guests. They developed a rhythm, a trust, a friendship that went deeper than television. But there was one thing Don never talked about. Not on the show. Not in interviews. Not anywhere. His father, Max Rickles, died in 1953. He never saw his son become famous. He never saw Don perform at the Copa. He never saw him on The Tonight Show. He never saw any of it, and Don never got to hear his father say, "I was wrong. You made it. I'm proud of you." For 35 years, Don buried that pain. He worked. He performed. He made millions of people laugh. He married Barbara, the love of his life. He raised his children. He built a career that most comedians only dream about. But late at night, in quiet moments, the voice was still there. His father's voice. You're wasting your life. In early 1988, Don Rickles turned 61 years old. He was at the peak of his career, but something was shifting inside him. He was tired of the armor, tired of always being on, tired of hiding. Barbara noticed it first. Her husband would sit in their living room in Los Angeles, staring out the window, lost in thought. When she'd ask what was wrong, he'd wave it off with a joke. But she knew. "You need to tell someone," Barbara said one evening. "You've been carrying this too long." Don looked at her. "Tell who?" "Tell Johnny." Don shook his head. "Johnny doesn't need to hear about my problems. That's not what the show is for." But Barbara was persistent. "Johnny is your friend. Real friends don't just laugh together. They hurt together too." On February 17th, 1988, Don Rickles was scheduled to appear on The Tonight Show. It was supposed to be a typical appearance. Come out, do 10 minutes of insults, plug his upcoming show at the Sahara in Las Vegas, and leave everyone laughing. But when Don arrived at NBC Studios that afternoon, he pulled Johnny aside backstage. "Can we talk for a minute?" Don asked. Johnny could see something was different. Don's usual energy was muted. His eyes looked tired. "Of course," Johnny said. "What's going on?" Don hesitated. "I want to tell a story tonight, a real story, about my father." Johnny studied his friend's face. "Are you sure?" "No," Don admitted, "but I think I need to." Johnny put his hand on Don's shoulder. "Then we'll do it, whatever you need." The show started normally. Johnny did his monologue. The audience laughed. Doc Severinsen played. Everything felt like every other Tonight Show. Then Ed McMahon announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, Don Rickles." Don walked out in his signature style, arms spread wide, soaking in the applause. He sat down on the couch. He and Johnny exchanged a few jokes. The audience was eating it up. But then Johnny asked, "So what have you been up to lately, Don?" And something in Don's expression changed. He looked down at his hands for a moment. Then he looked back up at Johnny. "You know what, Johnny," Don said quietly, "I want to tell you something I've never talked about on television before." The audience sensed the shift. The laughter faded. Johnny leaned forward, giving Don his complete attention. "Go ahead," Johnny said softly. Don took a breath. "My father never believed in me. Not as a comedian, not as an entertainer. He thought I was throwing my life away." The studio was completely silent now. "He died in 1953, Don continued, "before any of this happened, before I made it, and I never got to show him that it was all worth it. I never got to hear him say he was proud." Don's voice cracked on the word proud. His eyes were starting to glisten. Johnny didn't interrupt. He just listened. The camera stayed on Don's face. "For years," Don said, "I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I did it anyway. I became successful anyway. But the truth is, Johnny, it did matter. It mattered so much." A tear rolled down Don Rickles' cheek. The audience was frozen. "I spent my whole career making people laugh," Don said. "And sometimes I wonder if I was really just trying to prove something to a man who's been gone for 35 years. Johnny Carson, the man who always had the perfect comeback, the perfect joke, the perfect line to lighten any moment, said nothing. Instead, he stood up from behind his desk, he walked around to the couch, and he sat down next to Don Rickles. The audience watched in stunned silence as Johnny put his arm around his friend's shoulders. No jokes, no transition, no commercial break. "Don," Johnny said quietly, "your father would be incredibly proud of you. Everyone watching right now can see that. Everyone who's ever seen you perform can see that." Don nodded, wiping his eyes. "Thank you, Johnny." "But more than that," Johnny continued, "I'm proud of you, not just for what you've accomplished, but for having the courage to say this, right here, right now." The applause started slowly. One person, then two. Then the entire audience was on their feet, clapping. Not the wild, excited applause of a comedy show, but something deeper. Something that felt like a collective embrace. Doc Severinsen had tears in his eyes. Ed McMahon was wiping his face with a handkerchief. And Johnny Carson, who'd interviewed thousands of people and never lost his composure, looked like he might break down himself. When the show went to commercial, Johnny kept his arm around Don. The cameras stopped rolling, but the moment continued. "You okay?" Johnny asked. Don nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." "That took guts," Johnny said. "Real guts." "I learned it from watching you," Don replied. "You've always been real with people, Johnny, even when it's hard." When the show came back from commercial, They lightened the mood. Don made a few jokes, Johnny laughed. The show ended the way Tonight shows were supposed to end, with humor and warmth and the audience feeling good. But something had changed. America had just seen Don Rickles without the armor, and they loved him even more for it. The response was overwhelming. NBC received thousands of letters in the days following that episode. People wrote to tell Don that they understood, that they had complicated relationships with their own fathers, that they'd spent their lives trying to prove themselves to parents who were no longer alive to see it. One letter came from a man in Ohio who wrote, "Mr. Rickles, I'm 72 years old. My father told me I'd never amount to anything. He died in 1960. Last night, watching you talk to Johnny, I cried for the first time in 28 years. Thank you for making me feel less alone." Don kept that letter in his wallet for the rest of his life. Johnny called Don the day after the show aired. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Lighter," Don said. "Like I put down something I'd been carrying forever." "Good," Johnny said. "That's exactly how it should feel." After that night, something shifted in Don Rickles' career. He was still the insult comic. He still roasted people. He still made audiences howl with laughter. But there was a new dimension to his performances. He started talking more openly about vulnerability, about fear, about the things that make us human underneath all our defenses. In interviews, he'd reference that Tonight Show appearance. "Johnny gave me permission to be honest," Don would say, "and that changed my life." Don and Johnny's friendship deepened even more after that night. They'd talk on the phone regularly. They'd have dinner together when their schedules allowed. And when Johnny retired from The Tonight Show in 1992, Don was there in the audience, tears streaming down his face as Johnny said goodbye. Years later, when Johnny passed away in 2005, Don spoke at a private memorial service. He told stories. He made people laugh. But at the end, his voice got quiet. "Johnny Carson saw me," Don said, "the real me, and he didn't look away. That's what real friendship is." Don Rickles continued performing until he was 90 years old. He never slowed down. He never stopped making people laugh. But he also never forgot that February night in 1988 when he finally let his armor crack. In his final interview before his death in 2017, a reporter asked Don, "What's your proudest moment in show business?" Don thought for a moment. "It wasn't a big movie role or a sold-out show or anything like that," he said. "It was the night I told Johnny Carson about my father. That was the night I stopped performing and started being honest. And honest is always better than funny." Today, when people talk about The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, they often mention the big moments. Muhammad Ali, Bette Midler's farewell, Ed Ames's tomahawk throw. But for those who watched Don Rickles that February night in 1988, nothing compares to what they witnessed. Because they didn't just see a comedian tell jokes. They saw a human being drop his defenses and admit he was hurting. And they saw another human being, Johnny Carson, respond with nothing but compassion and love. That's what great television really is. Not the scripted moments, not the planned surprises, but the unguarded truth between two friends who trust each other enough to be vulnerable. Don Rickles spent 40 years hiding behind insults. But in the end, what people remember most isn't the jokes. It's the moment he stopped joking and started healing. If you grew up watching The Tonight Show, if you remember Don Rickles, or if you've ever struggled with a parent who never got to see who you became, leave a comment below. Share your story. Let's honor the memory of two men who showed us that it's never too weak to be honest. And if this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories about Johnny Carson and the incredible guests who made The Tonight Show unforgettable. Because these stories aren't just about celebrities. They're about all of us.